Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Pen Vicarage on this Monday morning. Lovely to see you, and thank you for joining us for our Bible reflection for today, continuing our adventure through the book of Exodus. If I remind you of the context, what's happened is the people of God have been set free from slavery in Egypt under the Egyptians. God has freed them under the leadership of a guy called Moses. They've left there, they've gone through the Red Sea, and they're now traversing the desert before, a few years later, they reach the Promised Land. And what's happened so far in terms of now they've left Egypt. Of course, they're not under Egyptian rule anymore, but they do need law and order. So God gives them some laws. And he starts in chapter 19 when Moses is judging the people, and his father-in-law Jethro advises him to get some help in doing it. In chapter 20, of course, you get the wonderful 10 Commandments. For the rest of the book, really, we get, I think, about 601 further laws. Let's kind of unpack what the 10 Commandments mean. So without further ado, Exodus 21. And I hope you find this interesting. These are the ordinances that you shall set before them. When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th he shall go out a free person without debt. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave declares, I love my master, my wife and my children, I will not go out a free person, then his master shall bring him before God. He shall be brought to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him for life. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who designated for herself, then he shall have her redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt unfairly with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish the food, the clothing, or marital rights of the first wife. And if he does not do these things for her, she shall go out without debt, without payment of money. Whoever strikes a person mortally shall be put to death. If it was not premeditated, but came about by an act of God, then I will appoint for you a place to which the killer may flee. But if someone willfully attacks and kills another by treachery, you shall take the killer from my altar for execution. Whoever strikes father or mother shall be put to death. Whoever kidnaps a person, whether that person has been sold or is held in possession, shall be put to death. Whoever curses father or mother shall be put to death. When individuals quarrel, and one strikes the other with a stone or fist so that the injured party, though not dead, is confined to bed, but recovers and walks around outside with the help of a staff, then the assailant shall be free of liability, except to pay for the loss of time and to arrange for a full recovery. When a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod, and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there's no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there's a miscarriage, yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined for what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. When a slave owner strikes the eye of a male or female slave, destroying it, the owner shall let the slave go, a free person, to compensate for the eye. If the owner knocks out a tooth of a male or female slave, the slave shall be let go, a free person, to compensate for the tooth. When an ox gores a man or woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be When an ox gores a man or woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall be liable. If the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not restrained it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. If a ransom is imposed on the owner, then the owner shall pay whatever is imposed for the redemption of a victim's life. If it gores a boy or girl, the owner shall be dealt with according to the same rule. If the ox gores a male or female slave, the owner shall pay to the slave owner 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. If someone leaves a pit open or digs a pit and does not cover it, and the ox or donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution, giving money to its owner, but keeping the dead animal. If someone's ox hurts the ox of another so that it dies, They shall sell the live ox and divide the price of it, and the dead animal they shall also divide. But if it was known that the ox was accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has not restrained it, the owner shall restore the ox for ox, but keep the dead animal. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, when you read some of this, it does read rather harshly, but I think you have to remember that it was 4,500 years ago in a brutal society. And actually, if you put it like that, it makes you put its context in mind, it does read rather differently. So 4 things in particular from this morning, I'll be as brief as I can. Firstly, to do with slaves. Now, we find the whole idea of slavery abhorrent, partly because when we think of slavery, we tend to think of the awful transatlantic slave trade and so on. But I think what we've got here is rather different. People could be slaves for all servants or slaves for all sorts of reasons. But it was described to me in a comment as being a bit equivalent to a football team buying a player. They don't own the player as such, but the player kind of works for them. It's more on those lines. And I think you also have to recognise here that, of course, the people of God have been slaves in Egypt. And the difference between what happened in the slave trade and you compared to what you have here is rather different. So the slaves here do have rights. Slave owners cannot simply kill, and the slaves actually do have some rights here. Sure, they're obliged to work for their masters and so on and so on and so on. But if you read this carefully, and do read it again at your leisure, the slaves do have some rights. They're not just animals, they're to be treated like human beings. And there is actually option here where the slave can actually optionally remain a slave if they want to. So read it again, and it does read oddly to us a bit about slavery, because when we think of associations that we have with slavery. But read here, of course, that after 6 years, slaves get set free as well. Some opted to stay in, and actually, unlike what happened in Egypt, and unlike what we hear about in the transatlantic slave trade, the rights which slaves had here, the slaves did have some rights as well. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. The second thing I want to say concerns the law concerning murder. I mean, people do get killed from time to time. And again, it sounds harshly, if somebody murders somebody else and they get put to death. But I think what's interesting here is they're not just put to death summarily here. Notice here, there's definitely an argument here to do with intention. Sure, here, if somebody intentionally kills somebody, stalks them and kills them, then they get put to death. Of course, that's what we would call today first-degree murder. I'm not a lawyer, but I think the Americans would call it first-degree murder, premeditated killing. But there's a difference here between if you kill somebody accidentally, which is what I think the lawyers would call manslaughter these days. So it does. So notice here that actually, okay, there are strict laws concerning murder, but there is definitely an argument here to do with intention, and the definite difference here between what you call murder and what you call manslaughter. With deliberate killing is discerned from accidental killing. I think notice here the difference here. So it's, again, an argument for restraint. The third thing I want to say is the famous words, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And it goes through that in some detail. And again, you when you think about these days, you tend to think of sort of right-wing politicians and a hang 'em, flog 'em kind of thing, And I don't think that's what it's saying here. You have to remember this was 4,500 years ago, and society was brutal in those days. And I argue that I think this is actually here an argument for restraint. So I think what it's saying is, if someone knocks your tooth out, then only have their tooth. Don't kill them in response. If somebody pokes an eye out, okay, it's terrible. Take their out, but don't kill them. I actually think this is actually here an argument for restraint. This isn't about sort of hang and flog and stuff. It's actually about saying, only take. If you take, if you're going to take some recompense, then take it proportionately. A burn for a burn, but don't kill them in response. So. When someone knocks your tooth out, you might feel like killing them, and they probably did in those days. But what it's saying here is only take the tooth. So take restitution, but do it proportionally, I believe is what it's saying here. And finally, in the last few verses here, you have really rules to do here with responsibility. You're not allowed, if you leave a thumping hole in the ground and someone else's animal strays into it, then you have to restore that person's animal or give something in response. If we're landowners, we have a responsibility not to leave great big holes in the ground. If your animal, kills another animal, if that animal, if you've been warned about it and told about it before, and it's done it before, and you've done nothing about it, then you are liable for that animal. for a first. So I think there are here, you can see here the laws to do with to restitution and compensation and personal responsibility and this type of stuff as well. So you can kind of see the buddings of some laws here to do with recompense and compensation and so on in the event that people act responsibly and act irresponsibly and don't leave great big holes in the ground and let their animals behave let them behave bad and don't do anything about it. And so that you can see here laws of personal responsibility. People are responsible for their actions, and if you own land, if you own animals, then you are responsible for looking after them properly. So in this chapter 21, you have the first few of the 601 laws here to do with to do with the way God commanded the people of Israel should live. And you see again some very interesting and some very important things here. Firstly, to do with slavery and to do with when people work for you. And again, for the first time, really giving, unlike what happened in Egypt and unlike what happened with the transatlantic slave trade, actually here the slaves here do have some rights, and that's kind of for the first time. Secondly, laws to do with murder, the difference between killing someone deliberately, killing somebody accidentally. Thirdly, to do with laws of restitution, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Not being some sort of right-wing pedagogy, but actually more to do with restraint and appropriate restitution in the event that damage is done. And fourthly, laws to do with personal responsibility. And if you own land and if you own animals, you're responsible for looking after them properly. And I think you can see that the basis here of a really good and sensible legal system, which the kind of system, dare you say, that God would command. Friends, read it again at your leisure. Enjoy. God bless you. Any questions, just put them at the bottom. Have a lovely day. God bless. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday and have a lovely day and more tomorrow.